This is the story of how the United States government sent the FBI and the National Guard to seize a dinosaur. Not a drug lab, not a fugitive, but a 67-million-year-old Tyrannosaurus rex, pulled from the Hell Creek Formation, and the largest and most complete ever found, packed into crates under armed guard and locked inside a vault. And the people who pulled her out of the ground had to stand there and watch the whole thing fall apart. One of them would end up in federal prison. The bones at the center of it all would go on to sell for more money than anyone had ever paid for a fossil. This is what happens when a discovery becomes a crime. To understand how it got that far, you have to go back to a broken down truck on a foggy morning in August of 1990. A small team from the Black Hills Institute of Geological Research, a commercial fossil outfit out of Hill City, South Dakota, was wrapping up a summer of digging in the Hell Creek Formation near the town of Faith, South Dakota. On what was supposed to be their last day at the site, their old Suburban blew a tire. While the rest of the crew dealt with it, a field paleontologist named Sue Hendrickson decided to walk towards some cliffs the team hadn't checked yet. The fog hadn't even lifted. She went anyway, and that's when she saw them. Bones, weathering right out of the side of a cliff, and they were big. She carried a few fragments back to camp and handed them to the Institute's president, Peter Larson, and he knew almost immediately what he was holding. These were the bones of a Tyrannosaurus rex, and there were a lot of them. They named her Sue, after the woman who found her. It took the team 17 days to carefully cut her out of the rock and haul her back to Hill City. And when the dust settled, they realized exactly what they had. This was a T-Rex that was more than 90% complete. Almost nothing like it had ever stood in a museum, let alone come out of a small institute in South Dakota. This was the specimen of a lifetime. Now, before they ever touched a shovel, the team had done what they believed was the right thing. They went to the man who owned the land, a rancher named Maurice Williams, and they paid him $5,000. A handshake, a check, and as far as the Black Hills Institute was concerned, Sue was theirs. So they took her home and got to work, planning to build their entire institute around her. For nearly 2 years, they prepared her bones, they studied her, and they dreamed about the museum she would anchor. They had no idea the ground was already shifting under them, because as word spread about Sue, about how complete she was, about how extraordinary, about how valuable she might be, the question of who actually owned her stopped being simple. Maurice Williams started to say that his $5,000 had only paid for the right to dig on his land, not for the fossil itself. Williams was a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, and the tribe entered the dispute, arguing the bones had come from reservation land. And then came the detail that turned a contract argument into a federal case. Williams's land wasn't simply his. It was held in trust by the United States Department of the Interior. That one fact changed everything. If the land was federal trust land, then selling anything that came out of it, including a dinosaur, required the government's permission under federal law, including provisions tied to statutes like the Antiquities Act, governing what can and can't be taken from protected ground. And the government had never given it. Nobody at the Black Hills Institute had filed a single form, because as far as they knew, they bought the fossil fair and square from the man whose ranch it sat on. What they didn't know was that federal investigators had already been watching them, and the government was about to make an example out of Sue. It happened one morning in May of 1992, just after 7 in the morning. The people inside the Black Hills Institute looked up to find their building surrounded. Roughly 30 FBI agents, National Guard troops, federal officials. In a quiet town of a few hundred people, the federal government had arrived in force. And not for a person, but for a pile of bones, tens of millions of years old. The timing was almost cruel. Larson's team had just finished one of the most delicate operations of the entire project, separating Sue's massive skull from her hip bones, a process so risky it had taken more than a year. One wrong move and that priceless skull could have cracked from the inside. but they had pulled it off. By every account, they were still riding the high of it. And then there were agents standing in the office telling Peter Larson that he had stolen this from federal land and that they were there to take it. The seizure was not quick. It took federal agents 3 days to crate up Sue and cart her away, along with the Institute's records and other fossils. As the bones were loaded out, word raced through Hill City, and residents started showing up to protest. Ordinary people standing outside a small town building, watching armed federal agents haul off the dinosaur their neighbors had found. The national media came right along with them, and Sue, the most complete Tyrannosaurus rex ever discovered, was driven to the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology in Rapid City and locked inside a vault, where she would sit untouched while the courts decided her fate. Think about that for a second. A creature that had survived 67 million years in the ground, through the end of the Maastrichtian Age, through every extinction and upheaval since, was now evidence in a federal case, sealed in a back room because nobody could agree on who she belonged to. The legal war that followed was brutal, and the Black Hills Institute lost it. The courts worked through the ownership question and landed on the trust land technicality. Because Williams's property was held in trust by the federal government, the fossil counted as part of that land, which meant it could never have been sold without federal approval. The $5,000 handshake was meaningless. Sue, the court ruled, belonged to Maurice Williams, not to the people who found her, not to the people who spent 17 days freeing her from a cliff and 2 years preparing her bones. The higher courts let the ruling stand, and that was that. But losing Sue was only half of what happened to Peter Larson. Alongside the fight over the fossil, federal prosecutors went after the Institute itself, eventually stacking up more than 30 criminal charges against Larson and his colleagues. Charges that, on paper, could have put them away for decades. And when the dust finally settled, almost none of it stuck the way the headlines had suggested. Larson was convicted on a handful of counts that had nothing to do with Sue at all. Essentially, customs and currency violations, paperwork around moving money in and out of the country. Not one conviction was for stealing the dinosaur, and yet he was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. Sit with the shape of that. The man who recognized Sue from a few fragments of bone, who built his life's work around her, who helped lead one of the most careful fossil excavations in American history. That man went to prison, while the dinosaur he discovered sat in a government vault, and his institute was gutted. To a lot of people watching, including plenty inside the scientific community, and organizations like the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, which has long taken a formal position on the tension between commercial collecting and academic science, it didn't look like justice. It looked like the full weight of the federal government had come down on a small group of people in South Dakota, and that Sue had been the excuse. So where did all of it lead? What was the prize at the end of the raid? The lawsuits and the prison sentence. Money, an almost unbelievable amount of it. Because once the courts handed Sue to Maurice Williams, Williams did the one thing that guaranteed she would never quietly return to that little institute. He put her up for auction. And on October 4th, 1997, in a sales room at Sotheby's in New York City, the most complete Tyrannosaurus rex ever found went under the hammer. It took 9 minutes. When the bidding stopped, Sue had sold for $8.36 million, the highest price ever paid for a fossil at the time. The winning bid came from the Field Museum in Chicago, but the museum hadn't done it alone. The money came backed by corporate giants, McDonald's and Walt Disney among them. A fossil that the Black Hills Institute had bought for $5,000 was suddenly worth more than $8 million. And it had taken an FBI raid, a National Guard deployment, a years-long legal fight, and a man's freedom to get there. For most of the scientists watching, there was real relief that Sue ended up in a public museum instead of vanishing into a private collection. You can still go see her today in Chicago, but there's a harder truth underneath that relief, and it's the part almost nobody talks about. The government's case against Sue didn't just decide who owned one dinosaur, it set a precedent. It announced loudly that a great fossil could be worth a fortune, and that the people who own the land, not the people who do the science, are the ones holding the cards. After Sue sold for $8 million, the price of dinosaurs never came back down. It exploded. The Black Hills Institute itself had another famous T-Rex, a specimen they called Stan. And when Stan went to auction in 2020, he sold for $31.8 million. And just in 2024, a Stegosaurus named Apex sold for $44.6 million. These animals are drifting further and further out of reach of the museums and universities that actually study them, and into the hands of collectors and investors. A lot of paleontologists will tell you, flatly, that the modern fossil gold rush started in that Sotheby's sales room, and that it started because the government turned Sue into a test case. So here's the question the whole saga leaves behind. When a team finds an animal that died 67 million years before there was a United States, before there were borders, before there was anyone to sign a deed, who really owns it? The rancher whose land it happened to rest on? The federal government holding that land in trust? The scientists who recognized it for what it was and risked everything to dig it up? Or no one at all? The state's answer, in the end, was to send in the FBI, lock Sue in a vault, and send the man who found her to prison. And the dinosaur that started all of it is still standing in a museum in Chicago, 67 million years old, more than $8 million expensive, and in a way, still just a little bit stolen. So I'm curious what you think. If you had found Sue weathering out of that cliff, paid for her, spent 2 years of your life on her, and then watched the government haul her away, would you call that the law working or the law being weaponized? Let me know in the comments.